for the sake of having a name for them, what we're going to talk about is a D-loop loaded cast, and we're going to talk about a continuous loaded cast. And our D-loop loaded cast really is what all Spade casts were before Skagit lines. It's still what most Spade casts are, regardless of the line. And so there's a couple concepts that are universal in fly casting, and one I'm sure you all know from your single hand casting is that every movement in fly casting is a slow acceleration to a stop. So that's a stroke. That's when we refer to a back cast and a forward cast. Each of those individual movements is a slow acceleration to a stop. And the same is true with your spade casting. Line doesn't have to be aerialized for that to be true. So with our standard D-loop loaded spade cast, and let's just start with a circle spade. I'm going to make my setup, and that stroke is a slow acceleration to a stop. And then I'm going to come around and form a D-loop, and then make a forward cast. Now when I come around and make that D-loop, that stroke is a slow acceleration to a stop. So I'm coming around, and I'm stopping right there, and going straight forward. And in this scenario, when you form that D-loop, you're forming the D-loop 180 degrees from where you want to cast. And that D-loop loaded stroke makes it pretty easy to aim where you're going, because again, I'm sweeping, and on my sweep, I'm starting low, I'm finishing high, and I'm sweeping in a circle. I'm drawing an arc of a circle until I'm 180 degrees from my target. And then once I get to that point, I'm throwing a D-loop. I'm throwing a D-loop back 180 degrees to the target. So what I have here is I've stopped, I let that D-loop form, and that's what's loading my rod, okay? Is that D-loop going back. And when I see that D-loop form, I'm actually going to watch my anchor, my line on the water, and when I see that line straighten out, it's pointing in the direction of my most powerful cast, and it's also telling me when it's time to make the forward stroke. So immediately my eyes go to that anchor, D-loop, that anchor straightens out, and off it goes. And like I said, so on this sweep move, and it doesn't matter if it's a circle or a double spay, the path of my rod tip on the sweep is starting low and finishing high. And I want that to be a fairly continuous path. Reason being, I'm trying to maintain tension, and I'm moving this line. Line follows the path of my rod tip. So when I make that sweep move, I don't want to come up and come back down and then come back up. It just puts too much stick on the water. There's too much line on the water, and it's not really going to go. I mean, these casts are all going to turn over because I'm casting a short length of line, but in a fishing scenario, I need to be shooting line. I need to aerialize everything to get it out there and present my fly. So this is how most of us learn to spay cast. Stop there on the D-loop, make a forward stroke. Well, something these Skagit heads have really opened up for us are really heavy sink tips and really heavy flies. And there are scenarios where those are really helpful. Sometimes it's difficult to lift all that out of the water. And so that's where a continuous loaded cast can come in handy. And this is something the guys that designed these Skagit lines, that was sort of the whole point, is they were trying to deliver these really heavy sink tips and deliver these really heavy flies, and the old mid-belly type sink tip lines were just not turning that stuff over. These Skagit lines allowed us to turn it over and throw all this, but even still kind of at the extreme end of weight, really long 15, maybe 20-foot sink tips, huge dumbbell lead eyes on the fly. This D-loop loaded cast sometimes doesn't want to turn all that over, or doesn't really want to go the distance. So then they start playing around with the cast and came up with a continuous load. And what this is, and these are all really subtle differences, but a continuous loaded cast, coming back to that casting stroke of a slow acceleration to a stop, on a D-loop loaded cast, we're really making two strokes, right? A backstroke and a forward stroke. And however slight, there's a stop right there, okay? So you're stopping, D-loop is forming, rod bends, and then you go. That's really the equivalent of, with your single hand rod, the back cast and the forward cast. With a continuous loaded cast, we're making one stroke. We're making one long, slow acceleration to a stop. And so just to show you what that is, I'm going to come around without stopping and immediately go. Same thing on my right side. There's no stop on the back cast. There's no stopping to form a D-loop. There it is right there. I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit so you can see kind of the difference in how that loop is going out, how the line is going out. And so key to this, there's a couple little subtle things for a continuous loaded cast. For one, you've got to have a pretty solid anchor, and you'll see there's an incredible amount of lifting power with that cast in order to pull those heavy tips and heavy lead-eye flies out of the water. It doesn't necessarily have to be a heavy tip in a lead-eye fly. So if I have something lighter, and like right here I've got 10 feet of T14 and a lightly weighted tube fly. So not too much weight, but enough that I know it's there. But I need a really solid anchor. So if I'm fishing a lighter tip, a lighter fly, I'm actually going to make the setup and I'm going to pause and let all this sink, because I need that anchor to cast off of. And you see when I let that thing sit there and I let it sink and I let it get down, on my forward stroke, that loop really tightened up. That thing really wanted to go because it gives me a good solid anchor to cast against. The other difference is path of my rod tip. And so when I start my sweep stroke on this continuous loaded cast, I really have to focus on keeping my rod tip low and ramping it up high. And it's generally a lower rod tip to start that sweep than with my D-loop loaded cast. So with my D-loop loaded cast, if I want to, I can really keep my rod tip high and throw that D-loop straight back. Kind of the bow and arrow comparison. But with a continuous loaded cast, I've got to have this thing low to pull everything out of the water. I'm not throwing a D-loop that's going to help get that anchor out of the water. So I've got to make sure my rod is starting, basically at the surface of the water and coming over the top at the end. The other difference is that because I'm not stopping to throw a D-loop, and I need to maintain tension. I need to maintain load on the rod, because really the difference on the load of the rod, now we're dealing with centrifugal force. So my rod is going to come out wider. I'm basically, the way I think of it when I'm looking at the thing and making the cast is that I draw the D-loop. So with my rod tip, I move my rod tip where the D-loop would go, rather than coming to here and throwing a D-loop back and coming straight forward. I've got a much more circular path to my rod tip. It's coming all the way out. I'm generally keeping it pretty low, and I'm drawing the D-loop with the tip of my rod and maintaining tension throughout that cast. The other difference is that, again, coming back to our universal fly casting concept of a slow acceleration to a stop, because I only have one acceleration to a stop, you can really go any speed. You don't have to go super fast, which is a nice thing about this continuous loaded cast, but you have to accelerate. So if I start fast, I'm not leaving myself much room to accelerate. So in practice with this continuous loaded cast, I'm really slowing everything down. There's plenty of power in these rods. These lines, if everything's properly balanced, there's the grain weight in your line to pull that sink tip and fly out. So you don't have to go fast. Slow, 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 slow. Accelerate right there at the end on the forward stroke. And so again, probably the biggest utility of this continuous loaded cast is with really heavy tips, really heavy flies, pulling those things out of the water. And you'll see, as you're trying this, you'll really feel, the difference in the load. You'll physically feel it in your hands, in your rod, and it does change somewhat the trajectory of the line. It tends to sail higher in the water, which is actually, again, kind of nice, getting that heavy tip and heavy fly out of the water, versus a D-loop loaded cast, which tends to fly a little straighter. So if I really need to go distance with a sink tip, no matter how heavy or light it is, or heavy or light the fly is, I'm probably more likely to go to that continuous loaded cast. And it's just something, again, we all have it when we're on the water, casting's going great, and suddenly everything falls apart and you just can't figure it out. I just want to kind of, give you some different ways to achieve the same end so you can get your cast back on the water and get you back fishing. And I suppose it goes without saying, but since I didn't say it, I will mention, these are all water-loaded casts. This doesn't apply to our touch-and-go casts like a single spay or a snake roll.